"Sir, if you sign that, you won't be buying the company, you'll be giving it away." The words fell into the boardroom like a quiet object dropped onto glass, small but impossible to ignore, and the sound of Daniel Whitmore's pen scratching across the final page stopped mid-stroke as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward the far end of the polished oak table where Maya Carter stood, her visitor badge catching the cold overhead light, her hand steady at her sides while the city skyline stretched behind her through 40-foot windows that reflected the stunned faces of executives who weren't used to being interrupted, especially not by a young black woman sitting in the last chair near the wall, and for a moment no one spoke, not even the legal counsel whose tablet hovered mid-air, not even the CFO whose fingers were frozen above a calculator, because Daniel Whitmore never paused once he decided to sign something, and yet there he was, pen hovering inches above the paper, silver cufflinks glinting under recessed lighting, his expression unreadable as the quiet stretched longer than comfort allowed, and Maya felt the air change, the temperature in the room suddenly colder than the 72 degrees set on the smart thermostat, her heartbeat steady but loud in her ears while she realized she had crossed an invisible line, the kind that existed in rooms like this where hierarchy moved like gravity and everyone knew their place, and Maya Carter was not supposed to stand, not supposed to speak, not supposed to interrupt a billionaire seconds before a nine-figure acquisition, yet she remained upright, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze fixed on the contract resting in front of Daniel Whitmore, because something about the clause she had read 10 minutes earlier wouldn't let her stay silent, and she remembered how she almost ignored it, how she sat quietly near the back while executives discussed projections and market expansion, her laptop open but mostly untouched, invited only because a last-minute analyst had called in sick, and even then no one introduced her, no one asked her name, she was simply a quiet presence in a tailored charcoal blazer she bought on clearance 3 weeks ago, blending into the polished leather chairs and brushed steel fixtures like someone trained to disappear, and for most of the meeting she did exactly that, listening, observing, watching the way Daniel Whitmore commanded the room without raising his voice, the way executives leaned forward when he spoke, the way silence followed every sentence he finished, and she noticed the rhythm of power, the unspoken rule that no one challenged him, especially not someone at the bottom of the hierarchy, but then she saw the clause, buried halfway through page 17, a paragraph written in dense legal language that looked harmless until she read it twice, then 3 times, her eyes narrowing as she realized what it meant, the liability shift, the quiet transfer of risk, the structure designed to protect one side while exposing the other, and she felt the weight of it settle in her chest like a warning, and she told herself to stay quiet, told herself it wasn't her place, told herself someone more senior would catch it, but minutes passed and the discussion moved forward, and Daniel Whitmore reached for his pen, and something inside her refused to stay seated, and now she stood, the only person in the room without a title printed beneath their name on the agenda, and Daniel Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes toward her, his expression calm but sharp, studying her as if noticing her for the first time, and the sunlight reflecting off the glass behind him traced a thin line across the contract while the pen remained suspended in his fingers, and the silence deepened, stretching long enough that even the air felt heavier, and Maya Carter didn't move, didn't apologize, didn't lower her gaze, she simply stood in the quiet, holding her place in a room where she was never expected to exist at all. The silence stretched long enough for Maya to hear the faint hum of the building ventilation above the ceiling panels and the distant sound of traffic 30 floors below, a reminder of how high she had climbed in a building that was never meant for someone like her, and as she stood there she became suddenly aware of every detail around her, the polished table reflecting her silhouette, the faint scent of roasted coffee from a tray near the door, the soft ticking of Daniel Whitmore's watch as his wrist hovered above the contract, and in that suspended moment her mind drifted briefly to the path that had brought her into this room, a path that never looked like it would lead to a boardroom filled with executives in tailored suits and quiet authority, because Maya Carter did not come from the kind of background that usually ended up in meetings about acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She grew up in Toledo, Ohio, in a small 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat where the dryers rattled late into the night and the scent of detergent clung to the air like a second layer of paint. Her mother worked early shifts at a grocery store, leaving before sunrise, while her grandfather spent afternoons repairing broken radios at the kitchen table, teaching Maya to pay attention to the smallest details, teaching her that problems often hid in places most people overlooked, and Maya learned early that observation was her strength. She watched quietly in classrooms, listened carefully when teachers explained complex ideas, and read everything she could find, business articles, legal summaries, economic breakdowns, often printed from the public library where she spent weekends studying contracts she barely understood at first but slowly learned to decode. And even after earning a scholarship to a state university, she still felt like an outsider walking through hallways lined with polished glass and confident voices. She worked part-time in the campus administrative office, organizing documents, scanning reports, quietly absorbing the language of corporate negotiations, and when she graduated she did not land a high-profile job like many of her classmates. Instead she accepted temporary analyst work, short contracts that lasted weeks at a time, moving from office to office where she remained mostly invisible, learning, observing, improving, and today was supposed to be another temporary assignment, a last-minute call from a staffing agency asking if she could fill in for an analyst who was sick, a simple 4-hour meeting. Nothing more, and she arrived early, dressed carefully, reviewing the briefing packet while sitting in the waiting area where no one asked her name, no one offered introductions, and when she entered the boardroom she chose the seat closest to the wall, the seat people took when they did not expect to speak, and throughout the meeting she listened as projections filled the screen, growth charts rising in clean blue lines, executives nodding in agreement while Daniel Whitmore guided the conversation with calm precision, and Maya noticed how decisions formed quickly in this room, how momentum moved forward without hesitation, and then she saw the clause, a small paragraph framed in technical language that shifted responsibility in a way that did not align with the rest of the agreement, and she read it again while the meeting continued, her finger resting lightly against the edge of her tablet. And she told herself someone else would catch it, someone more experienced, someone with authority, but no one paused, no one questioned, and now she stood in the middle of that silence, her voice still echoing in the room, while Daniel Whitmore studied her with quiet curiosity, the pen still hovering above the contract as the executives exchanged uneasy glances, and Maya Carter realized that for the first time since entering the building, everyone in the room finally saw her. Daniel Whitmore did not lower his pen immediately, instead he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression calm but sharpened by the kind of attention that made entire rooms hold their breath, and the subtle shift in his posture sent a quiet ripple through the executives seated around the table, because everyone in that room understood that Daniel Whitmore rarely entertained interruptions, especially from someone without a title. And yet he had not dismissed her, he had not called security. He had not even asked her to sit down, and that alone created a tension heavier than any raised voice could have produced. His fingers slowly rotated the pen between them while he studied Maya Carter as though assessing a variable he had not anticipated, and the morning sunlight sliding through the glass wall caught the silver threads in his dark hair, highlighting the stillness of his face, while the skyline behind him reflected across the polished surface of the table, and in that silence Maya became aware of the reputation that surrounded him, the stories she had read before coming to this assignment, the interviews describing how Daniel Whitmore built Whitmore Holdings from a single logistics company into a multi-industry powerhouse worth billions, how he negotiated deals without hesitation, how he once walked away from a $700 million acquisition because a single clause did not align with his long-term strategy, and how executives described him as calm, deliberate, and impossible to pressure, and now that same presence focused entirely on her, not with irritation but with quiet calculation, as though he was measuring the confidence behind her words. And across the table the chief financial officer shifted slightly in his chair, glancing between Maya and Daniel, while the legal advisor cleared his throat softly but said nothing, because no one wanted to interrupt this moment, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and even, asking a single question that carried more weight than a long speech, asking her what exactly she saw, and the question landed gently but firmly in the air, and Maya stepped forward half a pace, not aggressively but with calm intention, her eyes briefly moving to the contract resting in front of him, and she explained that the liability clause on page 17 transferred operational risk in a way that allowed the partner company to exit cleanly while leaving Whitmore Holdings responsible for post-acquisition losses, and she spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision, while Daniel listened without interrupting, his gaze shifting briefly down toward the contract but returning to her face, as if he was measuring not only her explanation but the steadiness behind it, and the room remained quiet, the kind of silence that felt structured rather than uncertain, and Maya felt the weight of the moment but did not rush her words. She described how the clause appeared standard at first glance but altered responsibility through layered language, and she noticed a few executives leaning closer, their attention drawn by the clarity of her explanation, while Daniel Whitmore's pen remained still between his fingers, and after she finished speaking he did not respond immediately. Instead he slowly lowered his eyes toward the contract, his expression unchanged but thoughtful, and the executives around the table exchanged subtle glances, sensing the shift, sensing that the momentum of the meeting had quietly changed direction, and Maya Carter remained standing, her posture steady, while the man known for decisive action now paused long enough for everyone in the room to realize that whatever happened next would no longer follow the path they expected. Daniel Whitmore's eyes moved slowly across the page as he turned the contract toward himself, the soft rustle of paper sounding louder than it should in a room that had gone completely still, and Maya watched as his gaze followed the dense legal language line by line, his expression calm but focused in a way that suggested he was no longer simply reviewing the document but dissecting it, and the executives around the table leaned subtly forward, sensing the shift, sensing that the quiet observation from a temporary analyst had redirected the momentum of a deal months in the making, while the legal advisor sitting 2 seats to Daniel's right adjusted his glasses and opened his tablet, scrolling quickly as though trying to verify the clause before Daniel reached his own conclusion, and the faint reflection of the skyline shimmered across the glass wall behind them, sunlight brightening the room but doing nothing to ease the tension that had settled over the table, and Maya remained standing, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, while she watched Daniel's brow tighten almost imperceptibly, a subtle change that did not escape the executives who knew him well, because Daniel Whitmore rarely revealed emotion, and when he did it was usually because something important had shifted, and across the table the chief operations officer shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the leather armrest before stopping himself, and the silence deepened as Daniel reached the paragraph Maya had referenced, his eyes pausing longer this time, scanning the language carefully, and he read it again, slower, and then once more, as though testing the logic behind the words, and Maya could see the exact moment the realization formed, not dramatic, not sudden, but quiet and deliberate, like a calculation resolving itself, and Daniel slowly lifted his hand from the page, the pen still resting between his fingers, and for a brief moment he did not move, he simply looked at the document while the executives waited, and then he flipped back one page, comparing sections, confirming alignment, and the legal advisor leaned slightly forward, ready to speak, but Daniel raised his hand gently without looking up, a subtle gesture that stopped the interruption before it began, and the room remained silent again. The only sound the distant hum of the building and the faint click of Daniel's watch as he lowered his wrist, and Maya noticed how the atmosphere in the room had changed, the earlier confidence replaced by cautious attention, and Daniel Whitmore finally leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze lifting from the contract toward the far end of the table where Maya still stood, and he studied her for a brief second, not with skepticism but with quiet acknowledgement, as though reassessing the assumptions he had made when the meeting began. And then he looked back down at the contract one last time, and without a word he slowly placed the pen flat on the table, the small sound of metal touching polished wood echoing softly across the room, and that single motion shifted everything, because the executives understood immediately that Daniel Whitmore had decided not to sign, and the momentum that had been moving forward minutes earlier dissolved into stillness, and Maya Carter remained standing as the weight of that decision settled over the room, while the sunlight continued to stretch across the table, illuminating the contract that would remain unsigned. The sound of the pen resting against the table lingered longer than anyone expected, and the executives around the room exchanged subtle glances, their earlier confidence now replaced with uncertainty, while the legal advisor straightened in his chair and leaned forward cautiously, his voice measured as he began to clarify that the clause could still be negotiated, but Daniel Whitmore did not immediately respond, his attention still fixed on the contract, his fingers resting lightly against the polished surface of the table as if weighing the gravity of what had just been avoided. And Maya Carter remained standing at the far end, aware that every eye in the room had shifted toward her, some curious, some skeptical, and a few quietly uncomfortable, because moments earlier she had been invisible, and now she had influenced a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the tension deepened when one of the senior executives cleared his throat and spoke with a restrained tone, suggesting that the clause had been reviewed by their legal team already and that the risk was minimal. His words careful but edged with doubt, and Maya felt the subtle pressure of hierarchy pushing back, the unspoken reminder that she did not hold authority in this room, and for a brief second she considered sitting down, returning to the quiet anonymity she had occupied earlier, but Daniel Whitmore slowly lifted his hand again, stopping the conversation before it gathered momentum, and the room fell silent once more, his calm authority filling the space without the need for raised volume. And he turned slightly toward Maya, his expression thoughtful. rather than confrontational, and asked her to walk them through exactly how she interpreted the language, and the request shifted the atmosphere again, transforming skepticism into attentive focus, and Maya stepped forward carefully, moving closer to the table while maintaining a respectful distance, and she pointed gently toward the paragraph, explaining how the clause linked to a secondary provision on the following page. How the phrasing allowed operational liabilities to transfer after acquisition milestones were met, and as she spoke the executives leaned forward, some scanning their printed copies, others scrolling quickly on tablets, and the legal advisor's expression tightened as he followed her explanation, recognizing the layered structure she described, and Daniel Whitmore listened quietly, his posture relaxed but alert, while the sunlight continued to stretch across the table, illuminating the line she referenced, and Maya finished her explanation calmly, her voice steady, not dramatic, not defensive, simply presenting the logic as she understood it, and when she finished the silence returned, heavier now but different, because uncertainty had shifted toward recognition, and Daniel Whitmore glanced briefly toward the legal advisor, who nodded slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful concern, and the chief financial officer leaned back slightly, exhaling softly as though realizing how close the company had come to accepting hidden risk, and Daniel Whitmore finally leaned back in his chair, his gaze returning to Maya Carter, studying her with quiet respect that had not been there earlier, and for a moment he said nothing, allowing the weight of the decision to settle across the room, while Maya remained composed, aware that the tension had not fully lifted, but sensing that the balance of power in the room had shifted in a way no one had expected when the meeting began. The room settled into a quiet that felt different now, no longer tense but reflective, as though the energy that had filled the boardroom minutes earlier had softened into something more thoughtful, and Daniel Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting loosely on the table while his eyes moved once more across the contract, not searching anymore but absorbing what had nearly happened, and the sunlight from the wide glass windows stretched farther across the polished surface, warming the cool tones of steel and glass that defined the room, while outside the skyline shimmered in the late morning light, cars moving slowly below like distant patterns, and Maya Carter remained standing, her posture calm, her hands relaxed at her sides, feeling the quiet settle around her like a pause between breaths, and for a moment no one spoke, not the executives, not the legal team, not even Daniel Whitmore, because the realization had shifted the mood of the meeting into something quieter, more human, and Maya felt the weight of her own heartbeat slow as the silence gave her space to think, space to feel the unfamiliar sensation of being seen in a room where she had expected to disappear, and she remembered sitting in the waiting area earlier that morning, adjusting her blazer, reviewing the packet quietly while employees passed by without noticing her, and now the same people were watching her with a different expression, one that carried curiosity instead of dismissal, and the chief financial officer leaned back slightly, exhaling as though releasing tension he did not realize he had been holding, while the legal advisor closed his tablet slowly, his earlier urgency replaced with thoughtful stillness, and Daniel Whitmore's gaze shifted briefly toward the city beyond the windows, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, and for a brief moment he looked less like a billionaire negotiating a deal and more like someone reconsidering a decision that could have changed the direction of an entire company, and Maya noticed the subtle change in his expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but thoughtful, as though he was measuring more than numbers, measuring the quiet courage it had taken for someone without authority to speak when silence would have been easier, and the air in the room felt warmer now, the tension replaced by a calm that allowed everyone to breathe again, and Maya slowly returned her gaze to the table, her attention resting on the unsigned contract, the paper lying still under the sunlight, and the quiet stretched gently, not uncomfortable but reflective, as though the room itself was absorbing the significance of the moment, and Daniel Whitmore finally shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the contract, while the executives waited without speaking, sensing that whatever came next would carry a different tone than before, and Maya Carter remained composed, standing in the calm light of the boardroom, her presence no longer invisible, her voice no longer uncertain, as the silence settled into something that felt like the quiet before a new beginning. Daniel Whitmore finally reached forward and pulled the contract closer again, not with urgency but with deliberate calm, and the soft sound of paper sliding across polished wood drew every eye back to him, while Maya Carter remained still, watching quietly as he flipped once more to the clause she had identified, his fingers tracing the paragraph slowly as if confirming what he already understood, and the executives around the table leaned forward subtly, sensing that something more than caution was unfolding, and Daniel turned one page, then another, connecting sections, following references, and the silence deepened as the legal advisor opened his tablet again, scrolling quickly, his expression tightening as he began to see the layered implications Maya had described, and the chief financial officer leaned closer to his own copy, his brow narrowing, and one of the senior executives exchanged a glance with another, the earlier confidence replaced by quiet concern, and Daniel Whitmore finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, stating that the clause did not merely shift operational liability but created a delayed exposure that could affect Whitmore Holdings months after acquisition milestones were completed, and the word settled heavily across the room, because this was no longer speculation, it was confirmation, and the legal advisor nodded slowly, acknowledging that the structure allowed the partner company to exit cleanly if performance targets were not met, leaving Whitmore Holdings responsible for downstream operational costs, and the realization moved through the room like a silent wave, executives leaning back slightly, absorbing the magnitude of what had almost been approved, and Daniel Whitmore glanced briefly toward Maya Carter, his expression thoughtful, not dramatic, but quietly respectful, and he asked the legal team to run a quick internal review of the clause alignment with the rest of the agreement, and within seconds tablets lit up, fingers moved across screens, and the calm urgency of experienced professionals filled the space, while Maya remained standing, her presence steady, her gaze calm, as though she had already released the tension that had carried her to speak, and after a brief moment the legal advisor looked up again, confirming that the clause had not been fully flagged during preliminary review because it was nested within technical language tied to performance benchmarks, and Daniel Whitmore nodded once, absorbing the explanation, and the chief financial officer exhaled softly, shaking his head almost imperceptibly, and Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes lifting toward Maya once more, and for a brief second the entire room seemed to follow that gaze, recognizing the quiet shift that had taken place, because a temporary analyst, someone who had entered the room without introduction, had altered the course of a major decision, and Daniel Whitmore rested his hands lightly on the table, the sunlight catching the edge of the unsigned contract, and the silence returned again, but this time it carried recognition rather than tension. As Maya Carter stood in the calm light, her voice no longer an interruption but the reason the room had paused at all. Daniel Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, and the movement alone drew the attention of everyone at the table, because the tone of the meeting had already changed and now every gesture carried meaning, and he reached forward, not toward the contract this time, but toward the small nameplate resting near the center of the table, sliding it gently aside as if clearing space for something more important, and his eyes lifted again toward Maya Carter, studying her not as an interruption but as someone who had altered the course of the conversation, and the sunlight from the windows reflected softly across his expression, making the room feel quieter, more deliberate, while the executives remained still, sensing that something unexpected was about to unfold, and Daniel Whitmore spoke calmly, asking her name, and the question seemed simple yet carried weight because no one had asked it before, and Maya answered quietly, her voice steady, introducing herself as Maya Carter, temporary analyst, and Daniel nodded once, absorbing the information, then asked how long she had been reviewing acquisition contracts, and Maya explained that most of her experience came from short-term assignments and independent study, her words measured and modest, and the chief financial officer glanced briefly at her again, curiosity replacing skepticism, while the legal advisor leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, and Daniel Whitmore listened carefully, then rested his hands lightly on the table, and the silence returned, but it was no longer uncertain, it felt reflective, and after a brief moment he acknowledged that her observation had prevented the company from accepting unnecessary exposure, his tone calm but sincere, and the executives around the table shifted slightly, recognizing the significance of the statement, because Daniel Whitmore rarely offered acknowledgement in such direct terms, and Maya felt the quiet weight of the moment settle gently, her posture remaining composed, her gaze calm, while Daniel glanced once more at the unsigned contract, then back toward her, and he asked if she had noticed any other inconsistencies during the meeting, and the question signaled something more than appreciation, it signaled trust, and Maya considered briefly before mentioning a secondary timeline alignment that might require clarification, and the legal advisor immediately made a note, nodding slightly, while Daniel Whitmore leaned back, the sunlight catching the edge of the table, and the atmosphere in the room softened further, as though the earlier hierarchy had loosened just enough to allow a new dynamic to form, and Maya Carter remained standing quietly, aware that she had not only influenced a decision but also shifted how the room viewed her, and Daniel Whitmore gave a small nod, a gesture subtle but meaningful, before turning slightly toward the rest of the executives, signaling that the meeting would continue under a new understanding, while the contract remained unsigned in the center of the table, resting in the warm light, and the calm recognition of Maya Carter's presence settled across the room like a quiet acknowledgement that some voices, even unexpected ones, could change everything. The meeting resumed quietly, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that everyone could feel, the earlier urgency replaced with careful deliberation as Daniel Whitmore leaned slightly forward, his fingers resting near the unsigned contract while the legal team continued reviewing adjustments, and Maya Carter slowly returned to her seat near the end of the table, her movements calm and unassuming, as though she intended to slip back into the quiet presence she had occupied before, but the room no longer allowed that invisibility, because several executives glanced toward her with subtle acknowledgement, their expressions thoughtful rather than dismissive, and the sunlight continued to stretch across the polished surface, illuminating the contract that now represented a decision avoided rather than a deal completed, and Daniel Whitmore listened to the legal advisor summarize proposed revisions, nodding occasionally, his attention measured and steady, while Maya folded her hands lightly in front of her, her heartbeat steadying as the moment settled into memory, and she reflected briefly on how quickly everything had changed, how she had entered the building expecting to observe quietly, and now she sat in a room that had paused because she chose to speak, and the meeting moved forward with a slower rhythm, executives asking more careful questions, projections revisited, timelines adjusted, and Daniel Whitmore eventually closed the folder containing the contract, signaling that the agreement would be postponed pending further review, and the decision felt calm but decisive, and the executives nodded, gathering their notes, while the room began to shift from tension into closure, chairs moving softly, tablets dimming, and as people prepared to leave, Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a brief moment, his gaze moving toward Maya Carter once more, and he gave a small nod, quiet but unmistakable, a gesture of acknowledgement that required no words, and Maya returned the nod gently, her expression calm, while the sunlight reflected across the table between them, and one by one the executives exited the boardroom, their voices low, the earlier intensity replaced with thoughtful conversation, and Maya gathered her tablet slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table as she stood, and she walked toward the door at the same measured pace she had entered earlier, but this time the silence around her felt different, not invisible, not overlooked, but quietly recognized, and as she reached the doorway she glanced once more toward the table where the unsigned contract rested in the soft morning light, and Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, watching the skyline beyond the glass, as though considering the quiet courage that had altered the course of the day, and Maya Carter stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her, while inside the boardroom the sunlight continued to rest on the empty chair where she had once sat unnoticed, leaving behind the quiet impression that sometimes the most powerful moments arrive not with noise, but with a single voice choosing to stand, and a pen that never touched the page.